I'm so pleased to introduce our next speaker. Lee Newman is the founding director of the Center for Health, Work, and Environment at the University of Colorado School of Public Health. I also just learned last night that he's a former journalist who is teaching the public health students how to communicate about public health, so let's give him an extra hand for that.
Thank you. It's interesting when I tell journalists that I used to be a journalist, they kind of, I think I don't know what they're thinking, but there was a reason that I think I started in journalism and found myself coming back to now teaching graduate students how to talk to journalists, because if I recognize a failure among the failures that we've had in public health, it's been a failure for people like me to bridge to people like you. We are partners, and when it comes to disseminating the information that we have as health scientists to the public, you all are better at that than we are. So how do we bridge is become kind of a theme for me. So what I'd like to do today is to, and that's a little bit about me, and I'll have this up at the end. If you want to find our center, if you want to find me, please reach out. But what I'd like to do today is start with if we could take away that little blocker there. I want to start, I always like to start with telling you who's funding the work that I'm going to tell you about. And in full disclosure, the work that I do with the Center for Health, Work, and Environment in Colorado, we have about 40 people doing occupational health and safety work around the world. In academia. It comes from the CDC, from the National Institutes of Health, including a project that we're doing with WestAT, with the National Institutes of Health, where we're engaging communities in West Denver and in rural Colorado around what communities see as their needs to address in terms of health impacts from climate. A project that I won't say much about, but I'll give you a little teaser about, that we're doing with the International Labor Organization, which is part of the UN, funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. And I want to point out to you that my first foray into the work that I'm going to tell you about started because I was contacted by the Director of Health and Safety from a corporation, an unlikely corporation, one of the largest sugar producers in Latin America, a company named Pantaleon, Grupo Pantaleon. And they reached out to me because they said, we have a problem. We have a problem of our workers getting this chronic kidney disease of unknown cause. It's what it's called, Mesoamerican nephropathy. Some of you were there this morning and heard a lecture on the subject. We have this problem. We've been trying to tackle it. We think that some of the things that you do in Colorado could be applicable. Would you consider working with us on this? And I thought, wow, this is really unlikely. Knowing what I know about sugar, the history of sugar production, its connection to things like rum and slavery, and all of my preconceived notions about the protections for health and well-being of workers in Latin America, I thought, well, this is pretty unlikely. So of course, what did I do? I went to Guatemala and met with them. And we came to the conclusion that under the right kind of an agreement, which gave me access, unfettered access to data, and the opportunity to engage directly with workers in their workforce who could volunteer to work with us, and with an assurance that the company would try to do what it could to implement the changes that we were going to recommend, not even knowing what they were. We ended up having our university sign an agreement with them, and we're 8 years in, and we've been able to conduct a lot of the research that I'll tell you about under that kind of an agreement. Very unusual agreement in my experience of nearly 40 years in the field of worker health and safety. And I'll also point out that our chancellor of our university has actually invested university funds to help our work go forward. So it's been a very interesting last 8 years, starting with a LinkedIn request coming to me from Guatemala City. Go figure. Here are the take-homes from today. I'm going to start with the end. So there have been many studies and reports that have focused on the scope of climate's impacts on human health. Most of them are correlational. They'll describe the exposures to heat, to extreme weather events, etc. They will show some evidence, correlational usually, from large data sets of its impact on various health conditions, but frankly, very few studies that go out and empirically, directly in the field, measure the health impacts of one or another consequence of climate change, such as heat. So that's where I'm coming from today, is to spend a little bit more time talking about some of the things that we try to do, including the soft underbelly of the work that we're doing, because it's not easy to do field work. It's imperfect science. It's not like putting elite athletes on treadmills and putting them in a hot room and having them run for 4 hours. It's not like taking a beautiful, huge data set on all-cause mortality and analyzing it against climate data and coming up with some p-values. It's somewhere in between. I want to point out that interventions in general are more likely to succeed if they apply certain principles. And that's what I'm going to sort of hand to you today, is how we think about intervention as a science, how we implement research in the field in order to have it not just show that it might work, but that it could actually be used in an enduring way, that it could be maintained. Along the way here, I'm going to be asking you to pose some questions. So we'll get to that. Now I want to tell you, my heart is in the workplace, and that's where my research is. So I'm going to be using this as the case study today. Workers are on the front line of climate change. They've been referred to by my colleagues as the climate canaries, much like the canaries that would be carried into the coal mines because they were particularly sensitive to carbon monoxide. When they dropped dead, you knew you had to get out. We're seeing workers as being on the front lines of climate change. And you all as science writers, I think, can advance public health by researching and communicating about what's happening to workers. So with that, here's an outline of what we're going to cover. I want to spend a few minutes on wicked problems. We're going to come to what that means. We're going to talk about some of the core principles of implementation science. And I'll be talking about one particular brand of that called RE-AIM. We'll talk about why focus on workers. I'm going to use as a case study today the work that we're doing in Guatemala and give you a little teaser of some of the work we're doing in greenhouses in Mexico. And we'll close again with some key questions. So this is a weird slide for me to use. This is actually a paper from the 1970s written by some professors of public planning. Let's see, what do they call it? Professor of Science of Design and Professor of City Planning, who wrote this paper, which the title is totally opaque to me. But here's what's so interesting about it. So I'll just read to you from the abstract. The search for scientific bases for confronting problems of social policy is bound to fail because of the nature of these problems. Think about climate change. They are wicked problems, and I'm not from Boston, but they're still wicked problems. They're wicked problems, whereas science has developed to deal with tame problems. So, if I write a grant to the NIH, they want me to write 3 specific aims. They're very clear. Like, I'm going to propose this hypothesis. I'm going to test this. I'm going to get this answer, and I will incrementally move science forward. It is tame science. We have boiled it down to simple statements that usually have a solution. What these folks are saying is that wicked problems defy that kind of methodology. So this is from one of my favorite papers that really summarized this concept. And it was a paper that was published in American Scientist a couple of years ago by Moritz and Kawa. And they basically, I think really elevated this notion of what is a wicked problem. And you can see this twisted knot figure, which is basically saying, this is like the Gordian knot. You really can't just unravel this. So let me ask you a question. This is kind of a raise your hand kind of question. So I'm going to give you the option. There are problems that are complicated. There are problems that are complex. This is now getting into complexity theory. Problems that are complicated, problems that are complex, and problems that are wicked. Let me give you an easy one. Raise your hand if you think that systemic racism in society is a complicated problem. Okay, I have a few hands. Raise your hand if you think it's a complex problem. Okay, raise your hand if you think it is a wicked problem. All right, so let's take another one. Putting a person on the moon. I'll come back and give you what I think are the answers in a minute. Putting a person on the moon. Raise your hand if you think that is a complicated problem. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's a complex problem. Raise your hand if you think it's a wicked problem. A few hands think it's wicked. Well, let me tell you from the complexity theory standpoint what this all means. If it's complicated, it means that you actually can solve for X. You can actually come up with an answer. And putting a person on the moon, once you figure out how to do it, more often than not, you can repeat it. That would be a complicated problem, okay? You can solve it, you got the solution, you can then repeat it. I'll give you an example, my favorite example. I have 2 great kids and a couple of grandkids of a complex problem. A complex problem is something that you may try to replicate it, like I tried to raise my 2 daughters the same way, my wife and I tried to raise them the same way, but you're not going to get the same result ever again, right? So when you factor in humans or society, it instantly becomes a complex problem. You can't just solve for X. You with me? So that's a superficial treatment of that. Wicked problems, you can't even necessarily define what the problem itself is, let alone come up with a solution. So this is the world that I think we're living in. And I recommend that you take a look at this article because wicked problems, which is what we're talking about when we're addressing heat and its impact on human health, these problems are unique. There's not even a clear problem definition. They're multi-causal. There are multiple stakeholders involved with multiple conflicting agendas, and we heard that from this panel. Great panel. It straddles different disciplinaries. I can't solve it myself. I trained actually as a lung physician and as a public health professor. I don't have all the skills. We need teams to do it. And you can get the idea here that, in fact, when you come up with solutions to part of the problem, it's not even whether you got it right. It's not about right or wrong. It's like more right or more wrong. So it's a tough space that we're working in. But that being said, we're going to plow ahead and we're going to try to come up with some definitions of part of these problems and attack them. And here it is. This is one of the many illustrations that you can see looking at how, starting from greenhouse gas emissions to climate change, you have all the downstream effects that we're experiencing today, whether you're talking about ocean acidification, the raising of average and extreme temperatures, other air pollutants such as particulate, and looking down the list, you get the floods, the heat waves, the drought, the fire, and on down you start to see the outcomes for human health, including our mental health, our heart disease rates, respiratory disease, et cetera. So translating this over to workers are in particular at risk. In almost every industry, what we do is we put workers every day at higher risk of whatever the hazard is. It may be a hazard that's out in the general environment, but we actually, as a societal agreement, for the most part, say, but if you're at work, we're going to let you be exposed to more lead in the air than if you lived out in the community. And in fact, you can look at the regs and you'll see that's true. We're going to let you be exposed to maybe more psychosocial stressors than you might have outside of work. Think toxic boss. So, we tend to allow ourselves that workers can be more greatly exposed. And when it comes to climate, all of these are examples where we allow workers to be more heavily exposed. And this is, for people who haven't seen this, the International Labor Organization, which is part of the UN, they're based in Geneva, been around for 100 years. They're the folks who promote decent work around the world. And they work with the major countries of the world to promote decent work. And they have these two very recent reports that have come out this year, which if you're trying to get your feet wet in the subject of workers and heat or workers and climate change, these are a great starting point. And some of the points that they make is that, let's go to heat. Globally, you got 2.4 billion workers. 70% of all working people on the planet are exposed to excessive heat, resulting in statistics. Now, even though I'm a scientist, I'm not fond of quoting statistics. I started out practicing medicine, and the reason that I focused on worker health and safety is because it made me mad. It made me mad that I was seeing workers coming into my clinic with incurable lung diseases, and I didn't want to think of them as statistics. But unfortunately, this is what sells the product to policymakers. These are the statistics. And I just refer you to the paper. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork for why we would think here today about workers as, if you will, the not so special case for addressing how heat impacts humans and what we do about it. So I'm going to focus on this wicked problem in particular. And this one is one of the impacts of heat, of extreme heat, on workers. And for those of you who were in the session this morning, you heard a great lecture already on chronic kidney disease. But here's kind of the wicked problem view that I have of it. So we have weather, we have extreme events, we have heat. That results, what does it do to humans? It causes heat stress. In the case of kidney disease, it's contributing to impacts on people's health, probably through a combination of doing extremely hard work in really hot conditions and also with exposure to toxins, to toxic materials. And we heard this morning about in Sri Lanka, for example, glyphosate and some work implicating agrochemicals as one of those contributing toxins. There are others. So what does that do? It impacts worker health and their physical work capacity. So you just can't work as hard or as productively as you would want to. It impacts your health. Those things also compromise your economic well-being and produces financial stress for you and your family. It reduces, in the case of agricultural workers, it reduces their productivity. So in addition to what Christy Ebby was telling us this morning about both the quantity of our crops and the quality of our crops going down, the people who have to get the crops to our table are going down. Another way that's contributing to food insecurity. So this is a wicked problem. So I'm going to switch gears and now tell you about a specific approach that we've taken to try to address this one part of this big knotted wicked problem. And it has to do with identifying what are the environmental contributors and potential solutions to this thing called chronic kidney disease of unknown cause. Raise your hand if you've previously heard about CKDU or Mesoamerican nephropathy. So some of you. So just to catch you up to speed with us, we're seeing that across the globe, the rates of chronic kidney disease of all causes are going up. going up faster than a lot of other things in terms of contributing to human poor health. And mixed in there, well, you have the usual causes related to things that are pretty common, like diabetes, hypertension, chronic kidney stones, polycystic kidney. So there are some known causes, known diseases that cause a lot of chronic kidney disease and kidney failure. But then there's this subset of it, which has been around probably at least since the 1970s, but we've become much more aware of in the last 15 to 20 years. And that is this thing that's called chronic kidney disease of unknown cause. It looks a little bit different, pathologically, and for those of us in clinical medicine, than other forms of kidney disease. And it's rampant, and it's global, and you're just going to hear more about it. And so we're seeing it in these agricultural communities. Here's an example of a sugarcane cutter in Guatemala holding an ergonomic machete. You can see how black his clothes are because usually in the hours just prior to cutting the cane, they still burn the fields. By the way, in the whole wicked problem sense, burning those fields is contributing carbon to the atmosphere. And agricultural burning continues to be a significant contributor. But that's not the story for today. It's just part of this wicked problem that connects to another wicked problem. So here's a worker, and I would like someone to shout out a guess of how many tons of sugarcane that man cuts in an average day. 100 tons? Okay. Do I hear less than 100? Yes. 2. I hear 2. Do I hear more than 2? What? Half a ton? No. More than 2. Do I have more than 2? Less than 100? 5? In Guatemala, it's 6. How many days in a row do they cut that? 6 days a week. With a day off, and then they do that again, and they do it for 6 months. They do it the entire harvest season. You know, when the rain stopped, they start cutting. Now that's around November, and they keep cutting until May or when the rains start again. And those workers are burning an average of about 3,600 to 4,000 kcal per shift. You know what it is? Anybody get on a treadmill and try to burn off 4,000 calories? Do it every day in an 8-hour shift. So they're cutting, they're trimming, they're stacking, and that's their job. And they're also breathing that. I'm not going to go into the causes of it, but this is just to reinforce the complexity of this. So the toxins and toxicants may be contributing, the heat exposures, possibly infectious agents, but it's all boiling down to some combination of heat, hard work in hot temperatures, probably in part dehydration, and the result is inflammation and damage to your kidneys. So that's kind of the quick story of CKDU. And right now what we're doing is we're looking at the intersection of heat exposure and also dust, because here's another interesting fun fact. It turns out that sugarcane is about 17% silica. Silica, when burned, and then when cut and you throw the dust back into the air, you get to inhale that, and some of it's going to travel through your lungs and into your kidneys. And that's where some of it settles. And that may be, along with other toxins, one of the things that when combined with heat and dehydration may be the combination that's triggering this chronic kidney disease. But heat keeps staying in this equation. So we've been doing some research in this particular area. And the way that you do this kind of work is you go out in the field and you measure the wet bulb globe temperature. There's one of our team, Deanna, who's setting up the wet bulb globe temperature station, and you heard a little bit about that in the last hour. You get the heat and the humidity, the surface radiation, and wind velocity, and you end up with a calculated number. We also can put these little tags on people's clothing to estimate how hot it is immediately around their body and how humid it is. And we're also doing studies where we have people swallow a temperature pill, and with Bluetooth, I can scan you, and I can know as it goes through your gut, I can know what your internal temperature is. It's at least a good estimate. So you do those kinds of studies with the cooperation of these workers, and they are phenomenal workers. I mean, these are folks who are, they are committed to improving conditions for themselves, and they also understand that they're contributing to something that might help others. And when their employer actually then does something based on the data, then that's why they're willing to keep working with us. So you do these studies, and you get data like these, which shows, this is just showing the outdoor temperature, the ambient temperatures on a particular day from like 7 in the morning until 6 at night, of the temperature readings close to their body. The red line is showing 35 degrees centigrade, which is where we would often define the risk for heat-related illness. And you can get an idea that they're at pretty high risk, right? They're crossing that line somewhere towards the late morning to midday in their work shift. And if you look at the heat index, now you incorporate data on humidity, they're rocketing up to as high as an index of 40. And I can tell you that at that kind of level, we would say, in fact, I think it's in the proposed OSHA rule that we heard about last hour, we would say you shouldn't be working. It's not even like half work. It's not a quarter of an hour work with rest. You'd stop work. So, but that's every day, and they're cutting 6 tons. What's happening inside their bodies? Not surprisingly, this is just data. I just pulled out any data slide to give you an illustration of it. This is February of 2022 on a pretty typical day for that time of year. And core body temperatures, people are basically what you and I would call having a fever. About 42% of them are experiencing heat strain just on an average day, but they're doing this every day. Okay, so that's kind of the context of what work is like right now in Guatemala. And we're also doing air sampling. This is our team out there with all the monitors. We hang these pumps that measure the air that's actually in the breathing zone of the workers, so we know how many particles of air pollution are getting into their bodies. And there are some of the workers showing off all the equipment that they're wearing to get some of these answers. And without going into it much, I'll just tell you these are wicked high levels of particulate air pollution. The dust levels are extraordinarily high. You heard during the last, and I just added these slides in after hearing the conversation in the last session. You heard about this question of what happens when people get off work. Can they recover? And at least during the harvest season for people working in places like rural Guatemala, and it's the same or worse if you go to Sri Lanka or India or these other countries, the same story applies, is that they have their work exposure, but they also have contributors from their home environment, as well as personal contributors that all influence their response to heat. And the short answer is that we're not giving people an opportunity to recover. They're not going home to air conditioning. They're not dunking their forearms in cool water. We were just talking on the break about how in Sri Lanka, as well as in parts of Latin America, the idea that you would drink a cold drink or that you would put your arms in cold water, there is a traditional perception that actually will make you sick. Right? Okay. So I have verification from Mexico and from Sri Lanka. So these are some home observations. When we go out and we're invited into the homes of these workers, you're looking at situations where they have 4 to 6 people in a bed in a 1 or 2 room home. About a third of them in this particular community are still using 3-stone fires where they're burning wood or other biomass for heat and for cooking. And if you ask the question, what happens to their body temperature, this is actually not the body temperature data. These are the data from just the temperature around their body when they're at work. And I showed you this earlier. This is the curve for the temperature at work. Here's 35 degrees. Here's a temperature of 101.5 in Fahrenheit. You have the daytime temperatures around them, and then these are the evening and overnight temperatures around them, right? Averaging still, well into the 90s Fahrenheit. So there's really no opportunity for these workers to get away from the heat and have the recovery which we really have come to count on.
What does it look like for the normal human?
So these are data for the temperature around me, and you're asking,
Like normal human beings, like when we are recovering in the night, like how does that shift?
oh, okay. So normally, if I showed you the correlating core body temperature data, which I don't have in this deck, our body temperatures, we would cool off. So even if we're going to run a low-grade fever during the workday, if we can go into an air-conditioned space, we're going to come back down to a normal body temperature. It doesn't happen immediately; it happens gradually, and we use different cooling strategies, right? And then it really depends upon, can you get into air conditioning? Can you stop exerting yourself? Because part of the contribution to our body heat is how hard we're working, right? And how well we can dissipate the heat. It depends on what clothes you're wearing, whether you are sweating or not, whether you're taking medicines that influence your ability to sweat, that adjust your temperature regulation, how hydrated you are. So I can't give you a simple answer, but these people are staying hot overnight. You might ask, I showed you all pictures of men. What about the women? I have an interesting story. I was writing a grant years ago. I said, we have some evidence that women are also being affected by this. And I basically proposed that the NIH fund research on women in Guatemala. And the answer I got from my peers was, why would you study women? We don't see any data showing that women are affected by this. I said, well, you have to give us the funding to do the study to show that happens. And so part of what you all struggle with is that there are so many gaps in our knowledge, and until we fill some of those, you're going to go like, well, show me the data. Well, we don't have the data yet. And we've heard that several times today, that it's these massive data gaps that are going to frustrate you all and frustrate us as well. And Chris, you were saying this morning. I thought you said that very, very clearly. So we're now conducting a series of studies looking at the women, and in part, it's timely because if you go to places like Guatemala, the men are leaving. The men have been heading to the border. They've been heading to other countries. They're looking for work, and the women are entering the workforce. So there is a shift to more women workers. And in some countries, women have always been doing things like cutting sugarcane and banana, et cetera. If you go to East Africa, it's more common than not that you'll see women as well as men cutting cane, for example. And this is not just a problem of sugarcane, by the way. This is cutting across lots of different industries, but I'm using sugarcane as the example. So we're now doing studies on heat and dust and hydration and the health of women. And I'm not going to tell you about those studies because they're still ongoing, but check in with me, and we're happy to share more with you. So that's really laying the groundwork for, and I want you, Amber, to tell me, how much time do I have? I've got plenty? Oh, that's great, because you made me nervous when you looked at your watch. Great, so here's where it gets fun. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, so now you have sort of an idea of kind of the scope of the problem that we're trying to tackle. And I said to my team, we've been at this for 8 years. We've actually been doing a series of what the fancy term is pragmatic comparative effectiveness trials. Anybody want to decode that? Who would like to tell me what a pragmatic comparative effectiveness trial is? Yeah, I'm the same way. But that's the way scientists talk to each other, right? Right? That's what we do, right? I mean, the whole thing, like I spend semesters with students trying to tell them to stop using the friggin' jargon. In fact, I was telling somebody that when I teach this class to public health students, I give them all little cowbells on the first day of class. And I tell them, anytime you hear jargon, I want you to ring your cowbell. And at the start of the semester, there's like the whole room is just like echoing because everyone's using jargon. Pragmatic, jargon. Comparative effectiveness, jargon. Okay, so what it means is that what we're doing is we're taking groups of workers who volunteer to be part of a study, and we're comparing what happens when we change something for that group of workers and then compare it to everybody else, to the workers who didn't get to participate in that change. And so I'm going to give you some examples of some of those pragmatic comparative effectiveness trials. These are first stage of doing intervention science in extremely challenging workplaces. So even though they're challenging workplaces, we should still be using the principles of good science to try to do them. And this is where we use the tools of what's called this emerging field of implementation science. And when we do dissemination and implementation science, it ties into the design of the intervention, of what we want to do. It's test as our solution. And think from the beginning, how are we going to evaluate it? How are we going to know that it made a difference and that it's a sustainable difference? And there have been some really great publications on this, including some recent work, and Christy was part of one of these papers, advancing climate change health adaptation through implementation science. And so here are just a few examples going back to some of the original papers up to more recent. And so we want to still use good principles, and this is where I want you all to actually kind of participate, because when we do implementation science, we actually need to challenge ourselves, and we want you all to challenge us to do stuff that's going to make a difference. So this is going to be hard for people to see, but you'll have my slide deck, and I encourage you to look at it. But basically, I want you to take away from this that there's a method for this, and here's the main thing that I want to communicate. So we start out by going, okay, I have an idea, and the idea is, after talking to workers, we find out that there's no water for them in the field. All right, what would be our first study? Let's put water in the field and then evaluate whether their kidneys do better than when there's no water in the field. I've sort of exaggerated it, but that would be the study design. And lo and behold, we can do a study, and we can show that when people have access to water, they drink it, they're less thirsty, their kidneys function better. This doesn't sound like rocket science, but still somebody has to demonstrate that that actually makes a difference. And when we do that, we've just done a pretty simple efficacy study, right? Think of it like a case and a control, right? It worked for them when they got water, and for the people who didn't get the water, it didn't work so well. Well, that's great while you're doing the study, but the next step is to show that it actually makes a difference when the researchers aren't looking at you. And the company now has to make it as a matter of their practice delivering water to the field. And does that actually get implemented on a regular basis? Are they, in fact, supplying clean water to the workers? And then come back and ask, did those workers differ from other workers who maybe didn't have access? Do you have the same effect when the scientists are no longer watching that carefully and it's becoming part of the practice? So, and that's called effectiveness. So you have efficacy, you have effectiveness, and if you can show that by doing this it makes a difference, ultimately what you want to know is it going to last? Will we keep doing it? So there are a couple slides in here that I'm not going to dwell on, but I encourage you to go back and look at, and it'll give you kind of the fundamentals of the way we think about problem solving in public health. And what I do want to focus on is this part of the story. So I told you that we can measure things and show that they are efficacious, show that when we get out of the way and we let maybe the company have an intervention, that it's effective. But then how do we know whether the things that we're trying to do are going to last? How do we know whether they're going to get to the people who need them the most? These are the questions that we're trying to make sure that scientists and public health practitioners, and in this case corporations, are thinking about when they try to come up with solutions to heat exposure. So there are these five terms, and it spells REAIM, which turns out, it's not really the order in which Russ Glasgow and others were thinking about it when they came up with this, but it spells something, so they made it in the order of REAIM. But what you have to ask yourself is, does the intervention that you're going to try, for example, giving people more water, does it have the reach? Can it get to all the people who need to benefit from it? You could prove that it works, but if you can't get to the water, who cares, right? Is there adoption? You get the water there, is the company going to encourage people to drink the water? Are people getting the knowledge that they need access to know why they should be drinking the water? So adoption is, and you all probably have this. Some of you who have ever worked for companies that have wellness programs. Anybody had a wellness program? Yeah. And they put things out there like, all sorts of, walking challenges, weigh and win. There are a lot of things that are good for us and that are beneficial. Diabetes prevention programs, these things are proven to work. But what we see across the board is we offer it to everybody, and small percentages of people actually participate, right? So, you might even have the reach to everybody in the company, but you don't have the adoption. So that's adoption. Implementation, we need to understand that in every situation, the ability to adopt this new best practice, even if it's proven, is going to vary company to company. So I'll give you an example. There's been a big push for probably a decade now that when it comes to heat and workers, that there are three things that everybody needs: water, rest, and shade. It turns out that the evidence for the effectiveness of water, rest, and shade, and I mean effectiveness of water, rest, and shade, varies a lot. And it varies a lot because being able to implement it is not the same everywhere. Example, I know of some researchers who, they were working in Nicaragua. They designed a portable shade apparatus that workers could carry around the field and set up and then take their rest breaks in the shade, and it worked there because it was really flat land. But when they took it to Guatemala, well, now they seemed too tall. The ground was not level. The workers are moving around a lot more. It no longer was a practical way of getting shade to the workers. Not a bad idea, but needed a different version of implementation. And then ultimately you need maintenance. How do you sustain the benefit? Is it something that's going to be cost effective? Will the company keep doing it? Will there be education of every worker who comes in so they understand why these things are being offered to them for the benefit of their health? Will the financial incentives be correctly aligned? And we heard about that a little bit here, right? If you pay people for their productivity, right, they often, since they're working for very low wages and they're trying to feed their family, there is an incentive to overwork. And by the way, we've got data showing that when you cut 8 tons of cane a day, you actually don't last the season. You're more likely to quit halfway through the season with your kidneys failing. So finding the right balance includes maintenance, includes getting the economic incentives for the workers and the companies right, as well as the cost of doing the program. So with that, let's talk about some interventions, and I'm going to ask you all to kind of pick out aspects of reach, efficacy, adoption, implementation, and maintenance with the time that we have left. Because what I'm encouraging you all to do is that, first of all, to look for the research that's being done, which you would identify as solutions-focused. And when you talk to your sources, when you talk to the researchers, when you're reading the studies, I want you to ask yourself and ask them questions around these concepts. Because again, just because you show that it works in this group of workers during this month in February of 2022 doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the solution work, right? So some intervention studies. Shown here on the left are some of the nurses that work in the field, and they're next to a large tanker that has the clean water. It's actually been tested for heavy metals to make sure that the volcanic soil that's leached cadmium and lead and uranium and other toxic metals into the water has been purified. They add some chemicals so that there aren't bacteria growing it. They're giving them clean water. And then in this particular study, the nurses are filling up the workers' jugs and sometimes giving them electrolytes as well. So here's an intervention. I mentioned hydration. What we did was, and this is now a number of years ago, we developed in Spanish and for visual, so that you don't have to have the reading comprehension, urine color charts. Realizing that, talking to the workers, they actually didn't know what dehydration looked like, but when they pee, they certainly could identify when their urine was dark and when it was light. Educational sessions done by the nurses and the doctors who actually have a strong trust relationship with the workers. We gave them incentives for hydration. If you ever had one of those wellness programs, you know what they do is they'll give, you can have $500 off of your health care for the year if you participate in the health screening, right? That kind of stuff. What I wanted the companies to do is to actually just give everybody a fair wage and forget about, incenting them to cut more cane. We'll get there someday, because I'm a hopeful person. But in the interim, I said, well, okay, if we can't take away that incentive that's bad for their health, let's give them an incentive that's good for their health. And so what we basically did was we had these workers weigh themselves in the morning. They could see what their weight was, weigh themselves again in the afternoon, subtracting for how sweaty and heavy their clothes were from all the sweat. And if they kept their body weight within a certain range, it meant that they were pretty well hydrated. We had them pee in a cup twice a day so we could actually measure that scientifically to know how concentrated their urine was. And if they got good scores on both of those, they got a token, they went into a raffle. Everybody loves a raffle, especially a raffle where in a given day, almost like half the people, like lottery tickets, right? Like everywhere you turn, there's a lottery ticket, right? People love a raffle. And then they could pick out what they wanted. They got socks, they got T-shirts, they got soap, they got things that were really practical, a soccer ball, that kind of thing. And guess what? What do you think happened in that study? They did really well, right? And when we talked to them afterwards, it had changed their attitudes about staying hydrated. So looking at them down the road, these workers now embrace the idea that this actually was a good thing for them, and they now knew what it took to do it. So that was one of our interventions, and the conclusion was that the conclusion from this study was that if you give workers the information that they need, and you give them access to the hydration that they need, they can really improve their hydration status. What do you think happened to their kidney function? You think their kidney function improved? It turns out that their acute kidney, like during the shift, across the work shift, improved, but not all of them improved. We still had before we started hydrating, doing the hydration study, about 70% of them were having an acute kidney injury across the work shift. We could show that their kidneys were failing to work as well 8 hours later. We got that from like 70% down to about 25 to 30%. We were still having kidney injury. So what did we conclude? Hydration alone doesn't address this. And they were already getting some rest breaks, and they were getting access to shade. Adding hydration helped, but didn't completely solve it. But it became an enduring thing for the company and for the workers to understand that this is part of staying healthy on your job. So that was progress. In fact, the sum of our data is showing that doing water, rest, and shade protocols are necessary and beneficial, but they're only partially protective. And so we had to move on. And our next question was, well, it used to be that we assumed that, oh, you don't really need to add electrolytes to, anybody do Gatorade or stuff like that when you exercise? These electrolyte-added drinks have become very popular. If you go to Guatemala or Mexico, what people are really choosing to drink are 2-liter bottles of Coke. That's much more common because they actually can't trust their water is part of it, and it becomes your way of keeping that sense of your energy and your caffeine levels up, and that's now pretty ingrained as almost like a cultural phenomenon. Congratulations, Coke. But what we said, but that's not going to give them their electrolytes. So we said, okay, we have to recognize that these people are elite athletes, right? The description of the calories they're burning, they're like doing a good day's training run for the Tour de France, but they're doing it every day, okay? So let's treat them like that. In fact, when we looked at their electrolytes, looked at their sodium and their potassium and other chloride levels in their blood, what it showed us was that they were all screwed up. We had people who were drinking too much plain water and other people who weren't drinking enough, and so they were all over the place. So we said, well, we need to do another one of these comparisons. And where do you start? You start by getting good powdered electrolytes that you can add to water, and then having a group of workers taste them and decide which, if any of them, they like. And actually, it turns out they liked one better than the other two. And then after a while, guess what? You get kind of bored of that, and then you want to switch to another one. But that's part of working with the community. Actually, as simple as that sounds, coming up with electrolytes, and then conducting a study in which they helped us basically come to the conclusion that these workers in those heat conditions and that level of exertion need to drink between 5 to 10 liters in a work shift. Who's ever drunk 10 liters of water and not thrown up? But they're going through, their hydration demands are very high, and if you don't replace the electrolytes at the same time, you end up actually diluting your bloodstream with all that water, and that can actually have health effects too. So, these are, that part is, I would call just complex. That part isn't the wicked part. We could come up with a recommendation which said, company, make sure you're supplying them and giving people the education so they understand the value of adding these electrolytes. Supply those electrolytes, and by the way, give people choice. Let them decide when they're thirsty and whether they want to drink plain water or whether they want to add electrolytes. And when you do that, things actually work out pretty well. Did it solve the kidney disease problem? Let me come back down here. When we added electrolytes, did it solve the kidney problem? No. Again, it improved it, but it didn't get us all the way there. But one thing that it did do was it turned out that they had less muscle damage. We didn't talk about that, right? When you work that hard, what happens? You actually start to, you ever have your muscles hurt after you do this kind of exertion? Right, you're actually breaking down muscle cells, and when you break down your muscle cells, you do muscle damage. You release certain chemicals, certain proteins into your bloodstream and into your urine, and when it concentrates there, we now think that the proteins from the muscle itself crystallize in the kidney and may be causing some of the inflammation. So we're going, we need to attack this muscle breakdown problem. So we did that, and it turns out the electrolytes really help with your muscle breakdown. So by the way, I encourage you to stay hydrated. So in this one, let me pause and ask you, to ask me some questions about this intervention, about reach. Well, forget about efficacy, but let's talk about reach and adoption and implementation and maintenance. Yes?
Yeah, the implementation variable that's in your study is known collectively, the literature, as nudging. Cass Sunstein has written a hell of a lot about it. And the issue that we see is that there's a sense of paternalism associated with using that type of variable in your studies. And there's been a lot of pushback because people are using that technique in a lot of different situations far past health consciousness. And I think that's a big problem. The other problem is I teach wickedness, and I also teach wickedness and stickiness in my graduate courses at NC State. And there's a fine distinction between wickedness and stickiness. There's also a political problem with wickedness in that it's often used in a way to make sure that the perception is that the problem is beyond our control. And actually, wickedness as a concept has been used as a label to discourage people from changing their behavior.
Thank you. My intention in using it is to jar people, but not in the sense of making it insurmountable. In fact, I said earlier I'm a hopeful person, and one of the things that we can't give up, even in the face of obstacles like we've seen with elections, or that we're seeing in the face of not successfully nudging our temperature variables, is we can't stop being hopeful. So I just want to make that point. When you design a study, the study should be self-limited. If you're going to do a study in order to prove the point, you then, and that's where that methodology needs to stop, and then you have to allow it to be implemented the way that the workers and their managers make it work for them. So I appreciate that point.
There's a question over there.
I was curious to know what was the most effective, strategy or engagement strategy that you use to encourage or incentivize behavioral change? What seemed to work best if you're getting them to do something different?
Yeah, the thing that worked best, first of all, was for this to be something that the workers were engaged in, that they had opportunities to comment on, to be giving feedback on, and for that to be a conversation with them and people who they trusted. And in fact, some of these conversations occur in Spanish, and some of them in local languages, and there are a number of them around the country. So I think that in terms of even to even start for something like this to start, it has to begin with trusted conversations. I'm giving you an oversimplified answer in the interest of time. There's a hand here.
How much buy-in, I know for this you were kind of brought in by the company, but how much buy-in is necessary from the companies themselves to implement something like this? Even just in the last hour, we were talking about how we heard about how a lot of times companies don't prioritize the health and lives of their workers. How much buy-in is necessary to see positive impacts from implementation like this?
Yeah, it's huge to get the company buy-in because the power differential is so extreme between the owners, the CEO, the managers and supervisors, and the workers. It's an extreme gap in terms of power and authority. And so, we try to make sure that we're working directly with workers, working with the supervisors and the managers, and also with the top management. And I don't have time for it today, but if you read any of our papers, you'll read some of them are talking about organization behavior change. So there's some individual changes that happen. We're focused more on how do we get the organizations to adopt better practices that treat people with dignity and treat them as humans who have agency. It's a big lift. I'm trivializing it here, even with those words. And we happen to be working with a company that's intending to do the right thing, but even they need repetition to remember why they're doing that and why they're investing in it. By the way, you do see some business-to-business dissemination. So in Guatemala now, most, and I can't verify this, but I'm told that most of the 10 largest sugar producers now have adopted the practices that we introduced at Pantaleon 3 or 4 years ago. And that's not with any direct interaction from us. That's actually business to business. So working vertically and then horizontally turns out to be, I'll call that a complex problem, addressing something which apologetically I'll call wicked. So I'll share with you the rest of these slides just so that you have them. But I want to end. How close am I to end? Am I past end? Oh, okay. Oh, I'm good. I'm on schedule. So I want to switch to this one, which is something which I think is extremely important. We sometimes assume when we see pictures in the media, and if you start looking at the stuff that's come out in the last 10 years, the video stories, et cetera, of people in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and other parts of the world dying of kidney failure, that is true, and that is tragic, and that is happening. But what if we could get upstream of that? What if we could screen workers for evidence of kidney injury before they got to the point of being in kidney failure? Could this be something that's reversible? And that question hadn't been answered before. So again, we said, well, we're going to need to investigate that. And this was probably maybe one of the more challenging things that we tried to do. And it was challenging because when you start doing screening tests on people, you have to think, well, who's going to use those data? And how might they use them that might be helpful or harmful? So who do I want to pick on? Oh, since you asked me a question, I'll pick on you, David. So you're working for a company, you're cutting sugar cane, and we asked you to come in halfway through the season and get a blood test. We're going to check your creatinine. We're going to see how your kidneys are working. And what do you want to know at that point before you put your arm out for me to draw your blood?
I'm going to want to know, let's see, well, is the test going to impact me or my performance in any way? I want to know why you're doing it, what you're going to learn from it. Yeah, those are, I guess, two things.
You want to add to that?
Yeah, would you get fired if you test badly?
Yeah, would I lose my job? And yeah, well, you were in the right direction. She just put a finer point on it. And you might also want to know, what are you going to do about it?
I was going to say, we also hear questions, will it hurt?
And will it hurt? Yeah. And it is in Pinchazo. We are going to poke you a little bit. And yes, that does hurt. Okay. Was there another question back there? Or a comment about that? Okay. All right. So you might lose your job. So first thing we had to do is we had established that to do a project like that, first of all, we were not going to share any of the data with the employer. It was between us and the individual. If the individual was found to have some decline in their kidney function compared to when they were first hired, we would give them that information, and then they would have the option to meet with the doctors. And the doctors, at that point, we had to make sure they had set up a system so that those workers would get to a nephrologist, would get to a kidney doctor to address the problem if it was really severe. And for the ones where it wasn't severe, we had to get an agreement with the company that these people were not going to be let go. They would actually be offered what we would in this country call light duty. They would be moved to a job. Like if you have an injury and you come back to work, your employer might, have you come back to work, but not lifting more than 10 pounds or whatever. There would be light duty accommodations. So we basically introduced the idea that there need to be accommodations. And when we had those things lined up, we had workers who were willing to volunteer and participate in the research. And what we learned was something extremely important, was that with early detection, we could find a percentage of people who were declining in their kidney function even within a couple of months of the start of the season. And when we did those things, like got them out of the heavy work, still kept their jobs, in severe cases got to medical attention, the disease that they were on the pathway to developing either stayed stable or improved. And a number of those workers, in fact, were able to go back to work, doing a better job of hydration, eliminating other risk factors, looking at, so for example, we'd find out that somebody was using a lot of pain medicines. Well, no wonder. It's really hard work. So they were taking diclofenac, and it was causing, and that turns out to be a kidney damaging NSAID, right? So, you start looking at what are the clinical things that could help people continue to work. And that told us something very important, that if we could introduce into our worldview of managing people who we know are doing hard work in the heat, and we invest in systems that look for diseases before they become severe, that maybe we don't have to have people end up on dialysis and dying of this disease as it expands internationally. So this is the kind of work that we're trying to do, but the goal is always to try to have it be something where there's enough evidence and enough buy-in and enough practicality for it to be adopted. And so now across Guatemala, the major companies are introducing, and I can't tell you for a fact that they're all doing it, but they are introducing earlier screening methods. And could that backfire? Could that turn out to be used in some punitive way? I can't control that, and it is possible. And so that's where the role that you all have and that people who do auditing have to try to ensure that we don't do things that are punitive at the same time that they're intended to be helpful. It's a tough world. If you want to read it in Spanish, we wrote up a summary of these various interventions that we've done. We intentionally published it in a Guatemalan medical journal because we thought most immediately that's where we wanted these results to go. I'll finish by telling you that we are now turning our attention, we're still working in Guatemala with NIH grants, but we were turning our attention to another instance, which is itself like climate change and heat impacts in microcosm, and that's in greenhouses. Greenhouse conditions around the world are perfect if you're a tomato. They're extremely hot, they're extremely humid, and we still expect people to do heavy work in these environments. And we were invited, we were selected by the International Labor Organization, which is part of the UN, a branch of, or a section within the ILO is called the Vision Zero Fund, to conduct a project looking at different health consequences of heat and humidity exposure in greenhouse workers. And again, this is an area where you can look up the Vision Zero Fund. You'll find reference to this research. You'll see videos of me standing there sweating in the middle of greenhouses. And this is what greenhouses look like in Jalisco, Mexico. They are massive football field size operations producing the tomatoes and peppers that we eat here in the States. And here are some of us in the field with the participating workers and some of our team, including some people from the ministry, the Institute of the Ministry of Social Security, the government agency that ensures health and safety of many of the workers in Mexico. We have portable machines for measuring people's kidney function, their electrolytes, et cetera. We're also doing studies of cognitive functioning and motor skills, because if you're not thinking clearly in the heat, and if you are clumsy in the heat, which we all are, you have more injuries in the heat. So these are other dimensions of heat impacts that we're working with these workers in these companies and with the International Labor Organization and EAMS to be addressing there. And again, it's all coming down to starting off with sessions with the workers themselves, separate from their employers, meetings with the employers and their managers, doing what we would call qualitative research. We're sitting there asking them, what's going on now and what do you think could be done better? And then coming back and working on using this framework, implementing some potential changes. We'll monitor how well those are adopted, and we'll be evaluating whether how the workers perceive it and how it's affecting their health. And we'll have, hopefully, a fast track for that influencing policy, at least internationally. May not benefit in the U.S., but internationally, I think it has the potential for policy impact. So coming back to the challenge to you all, it's to advance public health by researching and communicating about heat impacts on workers, and for you to be hopefully adopting some of this framework of re-aim as you start as you start reading and talking to people about their studies. You showed a 10% improvement in this marker. Is that going to be sustainable? And how do you know? Is it going to be adoptable in more than one situation? How do you know? Starting to ask those critical questions, because that's how we all get better at trying to tackle climate impacts. I have a lot of people doing knowledge. I'll just end it here and say thank you. And I think we probably have time for a couple of minutes.
Probably one more question, yeah.
Okay, I know we've taken some along the way. I'll take your question.
My question is, you mentioned some of the things you tried to, and that worked to reduce the chronic kidney disease of unknown cause, but what other hypotheses are there for what might actually be the reason, all of the reasons together that this is an increasing problem?
Yeah, I think that it's going to boil down to a combination of heat, dehydration, combined with any of a number of kidney toxins in someone's environment. And it may be that because in certain regions of Sri Lanka, that turns out to be glyphosate. In Guatemala, it may be more the diclofenac, or maybe the heavy metals that are in the water because of volcanoes. You know, there are going to be different toxin contributions, but heat is going to be heat plus. And that would be my best working hypothesis. Would you agree with that? Okay, and I have concurrence from Duke University, so I'm feeling really good now.
All right, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
everybody.
Lee.